We've just had the NATO summit, which was held in The Hague at the end of June. One of the main issues on the table was the requested military increase to 5%, which NATO Chief Mark Rutte was quite confident he could achieve. He has since called Trump daddy and other shenanigans like that, but CND UK has a clear no to NATO stance. Can you explain how dangerous these current escalations are?
Well, we all know how dangerous they are, don't we? We've just sort of seen in November last year, we had a situation over the Ukraine crisis where there was a real threat that nuclear weapons are going to be used. Massively dangerous situation. And from CND's point, we sort of oppose Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but we also recognise that the huge aggressive expansion of NATO has been absolutely central in terms of destabilising the region and destabilising the situation in Ukraine. And certainly the role of the US and Britain in that conflict has been incredibly dangerous. I mean, it was the really reckless decision by Biden and also by Starmer to agree to Ukraine using their long-range missiles, despite the fact that Russia had changed its nuclear use policy to say, we will consider using our nuclear weapons if these type of long-range missiles are fired into our territory. And nonetheless, they went ahead and agreed for Ukraine to use those missiles. And you then have this very, very dangerous situation where you had kind of ballistic long-range missiles firing across Ukraine and Russia. And, I think all of us were really, really sort of terrified that we were potentially going towards nuclear confrontation. And why? Why was this escalation taking place? It was because sort of Biden and Starmer were trying to sort of see if they could get any kind of greater geographical sort of gain for Ukraine in that conflict. But military experts were saying that those type of weaponry, those sort of missiles were not going to have any kind of really sort of significant impact in that conflict. Biden knew that, Starmer knew that. So it was actually about something else. You know what I mean? It was about sort of escalating the situation for Biden to come out of that conflict either strengthened or not in a situation where Ukraine had collapsed kind of militarily. But I think certainly from the British point of view, it was to show that Britain was this really strong military leadership in Europe, incredibly reckless. And at a time when the Ukrainian people had sort of made it clear they didn't want this war to be continuing. They wanted a very sort of quick conclusion. So I think that's the kind of background to why NATO is so dangerous. And now we have a situation where Mark Rutte, and obviously led, as you say, by Donald Trump, this is really about making Europe pay for Trump's global wars. It's been sort of presented by figures across Europe, particularly in sort of Germany and France, that this is about having a kind of independent militarism from the US and from NATO, but it's complete opposite. This is just sort of posturing to national countries. And like, Mark Rutte has said this himself, this is about Europe coordinating with the US so the US can kind of repivot to the Asia Pacific and, to have this very, very dangerous global confrontation with China, which would be an absolute catastrophe. So that's really what's going on. And this whole drive to the 5% of GDP for military spending, it's not about confronting Russia. Russia's economy is much, much, much smaller than a lot of European countries. It's not about that. It's totally about Trump's global war. So yeah, incredibly dangerous situation. And I think the wild rhetoric that we've seen, particularly from the British government, saying that, Russia is like in an immediate threat, sort of facing sort of invasion, this kind of thing, but also threatening Russia with how Britain's nuclear submarine, just one nuclear submarine, can incinerate 40 Russian cities. This kind of language is impacting the international situation. It's massively escalating these tensions at a time when we need to be doing the opposite. We need to be de-escalating. So I think as well as this big rise in military spending, it's also the sort of the rhetoric that's kind of going with it to justify these huge levels of spending.